Hello, English 9 students. It is day 10 trillion of quarantine. I hope you all wish the important women in your life happy Mother's Day. If you didn't, make sure you do. We have finished up night, so we are going to be moving on to reading a short story from David Lubar and then taking a look at some grammatical concepts that we've been covering in edits, just taking some more intensive time to work on those grammar concepts. So I do want to remind you, as we are nearing the end of the school year and the end of e-learning, thank God, of the late work policy. My late work policy has not changed because we are no longer physically in school. Same as it was before, it was very easy to carry over. Late work policy is as follows. If you submit something past the due date, shoot me an email and I will get it updated for you in PowerSchool. The reason I need the email is because even if you submitted it to Canvas last week, I had over 100 pieces of late work that I needed to track down. It's really not worth the time to go back through and say, did this person, one of like 100 assignments, get it turned in? Because sometimes people did, but most of the times it's not there. So in order to avoid me going on a wild goose chase and to make sure your assignments go in faster, it benefits both of us. Shoot me an email whenever you finish something and you submit it past the due date, and then I will get it updated for you in PowerSchool. Again, no change from what it was during school. Shoot me that email with the name of the assignment, and I will get it updated for you ASAP. So, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started. David Lubar is one of my favorite authors just because everything he writes is ridiculously strange, and this book is no exception. This is one of the more tame and normal titles that he has. It's just a book of short stories, and this one is a little more chilled than some of the others, but I would recommend if you're looking for something just different to read, David Lubar is great. So we're going to go ahead and read Head of the Class today as a nice segue into our focus on grammatical concepts this week. Head of the Class. Please, Rusty thought as he waited for Ms. Grimkin to return his paper, let it be okay this time. But he knew from the angry sound of her steps as she approached his desk that his paper was not anywhere near okay. Well, Rusty, Mrs. Grimkin said, holding the paper as if it were coated with a thick layer of wet germs, you didn't do very well. She dropped the report on his desk and turned toward her next victim. Rusty stared at the page. A sea of red circles and lines highlighted his mistakes. Stupid assignment, he muttered. Who cares about spelling and grammar? So what if I misspelled a few words? If he wrote L-I-T-E where he should have written L-I-G-H-T, anyone reading it would still know what he meant. No matter what anybody said, Rusty knew spelling wasn't important, especially not tiny mistakes like the one his teacher loved to point out. As Rusty watched Ms. Grimkin walk toward the front of the class, rage filled him, pumping into his heart and lungs and gut. He wanted to shout at her, but he'd already been kept after school more times than anyone else in the class. Instead of shouting, he closed his eyes and spoke softly, trying to hold in the anger. I wish whatever I did was right. I wish I made the rules. He almost managed to calm down, but when he opened his eyes and saw the paper again, anger exploded. He crumpled the sheet, squeezing it with all his strength into a tight ball. Leaping to his feet, he launched the paper across the room, not aiming anywhere, just trying to fling his rage away. The wadded paper shot toward Ms. Grimkin, hurtling straight for the back of her head as she reached her desk. Rusty froze, his arm still extended. Ms. Grimkin bent to pick up a book. The paper zipped past her head, just brushing the top fringes of her hair. It struck the blackboard and bounced up, following a perfect arc until it landed with barely a rustle in the half-filled wastebasket. As Ms. Grimkin rose with the book in her hand and turned to face the class, Rusty realized he was still standing. He sat quickly. Man, are you lucky, Steve said, leaning toward Rusty from his desk in the next row. That was 1,000,000 to 1 shot. Maybe 1,000,000,000 to 1. She'd have kept you after school for the rest of the year if you'd hit her. Maybe even gotten you expelled for good. Rusty nodded. He felt incredibly lucky. But his luck didn't last long. It vanished completely when Ms. Grimkin said, Clear your desk, class. Time for the spelling test. Test? Rusty grabbed his spelling book. I forgot to study, he said. You're doomed, Steve said. This is a hard one. Frantically, Rusty flipped the book open. What chapter was it? Rusty looked at the page. No, those words seemed too familiar. They had already done them. He flipped more pages, but went too far. Those words weren't right at all. Sweat rolled down the back of Rusty's neck. He continued to search through the book. Finally, he found the page with this week's words. "Clear your desks, class!" Rusty almost toppled off his chair as the shout crashed through his brain. Mrs. Grimkin was standing directly over him, glaring down with the undeniable anger of a stick of dynamite with just a billionth of an inch left on the fuse. Feeling that doom was about to grab him and squash him no matter what he did, Rusty shut his book and jammed it in his desk. "Stupid spelling," he muttered as he took out a piece of paper. "Barrel," Mrs. Grimkin said, giving the first word. Rusty muttered several phrases that would never be on any spelling test. Why did they have to start with that word? He could never remember whether it was B-A-R-R-E-L or B-A-R-R-L-E. "Holiday," Mrs. Grimkin said, spitting out the happy word like it hurt her mouth. Quickly, Rusty wrote B-A-R-R-E-L. It didn't look right. He erased it and wrote B-A-R-R-L-E. That's it, he thought. He hurried to catch up. His teacher was already on the third word. Rusty knew as he handed in his paper that he was in big trouble. On the way home that afternoon, he saw something that made him stamp his foot against the sidewalk. There, right on the corner of Main and Madison, was a delicatessen called the Pickle Barrel. E-L. "I'm so stupid," Rusty said. He couldn't believe he'd gotten it wrong. Pause the clip, take a moment to get to the assignment that is on Canvas for head of the class, and make a prediction. Where do you think this story is going? Go ahead and write down your prediction, what made you think so, and then we will continue with the story. So pause real quick, respond, and then come back and hit play. The next morning, first thing, Mrs. Grimkin threaded her way up and down the aisles, handing back the tests. Rusty slunk deeper into his seat, knowing that doom was headed his way. When Mrs. Grimkin reached in his desk, she dropped the paper in front of him without saying a word. Rusty stared. His mouth fell open. There, in red ink, where he usually got a 65 or a 70, was a score of 100, a perfect A-plus grade. Never in his life had he gotten that high a mark. It had to be a mistake. Or maybe it was a joke. Maybe Miss Grimkin would start laughing, then take out her pen, scratch off the grade, and write an F instead. Rusty scanned the sheet. Right at the top was barrel. He knew it was wrong, and he knew he should say something, but he didn't. While Rusty stared at his paper, he heard the tap and scritch of Miss Grimkin writing on the chalkboard. Around him, kids groaned. Rusty looked up. It was a history test this time. He hadn't studied. He'd known there was going to be a test, but he'd been too angry last night to open his books. He read the first question. Who was the 15th president? Lincoln, Rusty wrote. At least that was an easy one. He went on to the rest of the questions, barely managing to finish before the time ran out. As he left the room at the end of the day, Mrs. Grimkin called to him. "Rusty?" "Yes?" He waited for her to tell him that the spelling grade was a mistake. "It's good to see you finally making an effort," she said. "Thank you." Rusty hurried out. On the way home, he almost walked right past the deli without noticing anything, but an odd difference caught his eye. He stared at the sign over the door. The pickle. B-A-R-R-L-E. But Rusty ran home and pulled the dictionary from the bookcase. There it was, just like on the sign and on his paper. B-A-R-R-L-E. "I must have forgotten or something," he said, trying to remember exactly what the sign had looked like the day before. Spelling wasn't his best subject, so he knew the dictionary must be right. Rusty looked up one other thing and found bad news. According to the dictionary, Lincoln was the 16th president, not the 15th. That meant he'd had at least one wrong on the history quiz. Eager to get it over with, Rusty started on his homework. Miss Grimkin had told them to write an essay called What I Do After School. At least he could use the spell checker on his computer to make sure everything was all right. He'd never bothered using it before, but he didn't want to risk making any more mistakes. Rusty wrote carefully, trying to be sure there were no errors. The spell checker caught a bunch of problems, but fixed all of them. Once he was sure his essay was perfect, he printed it out. The first copy smeared as it came through the printer. Rusty made a second copy. That one came out fine, though he got a smudge of ink on the back of the page. The next day, when Rusty returned in his homework, Miss Grimkin handed back the history test. Sometimes she let the class read while she graded papers. As the kids around him were taking out their books, Rusty stared at his test. A+. Another perfect score. But what about Lincoln? Rusty reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of coins, and grabbed a penny. At least it looked like a penny, but he didn't recognize the face in the front of the coin. "Who's this?" he whispered, showing the penny to Steve. Steve gave him a puzzled look. "Grant. Who else? You know, president during the Civil War." The penny fell from Rusty's fingers and clattered to the floor. My mistakes become true, he realized, but not until Mrs. Grimkin reads them. She must have read the history test last night. Suddenly, with shaking hands, Rusty grabbed the smeared copy of his homework. "Check this, okay?" he asked, shoving it at Steve. Mrs. Grimkin glanced up, said shush, and then went back to grading the homework. "Kind of late for that, isn't it?" Steve whispered. "You already handed it in." "Please." Steve shrugged and took the copy from him. Rusty held his breath and watched Steve's face for any sign of trouble. A moment later, Steve grinned. "Oh no," Rusty thought. "You didn't check this very carefully, did you?" Steve asked. "The computer checked it," Rusty said. "There aren't any mistakes." "There can't be any mistakes." Steve shook his head. "No spelling mistakes, but that doesn't mean no mistakes. Here, look." He held out the paper and pointed. Rusty read the sentence. He didn't see anything wrong. The words were all spelled correctly as far as he could tell. "It looks fine to me." "Read it again," Steve said, pointing to the middle of the page. Rusty read the paragraph. It was about what happened when he got home from school. He'd written, "My mom and dad both work. Some kids have a parent around in the afternoon. I don't have anybody." He looked at Steve again, puzzled. "Right there," Steve said, tapping the words. "Anybody. That's not what you meant to say. You meant anybody." Steve smirked, then added, "One word, not two. Big difference." For an instant, Rusty didn't get it. Then, like the world's largest snowball, the meaning hit him smack in the face. His gaze shot toward the front of the room. Mrs. Grimkin was reading a paper with a smudge of ink on the back. Rusty had to stop her before she read his mistake. He leaped from his seat. Air whooshed past his ears. He was falling. His head hit the desk. Rusty looked down. It wasn't easy. He didn't have any body. "Good essay," Mrs. Grimkin said, walking up to his desk. She put the paper down, patted Rusty on the head, and walked away. After a while, the bell rang. The rest of the kids left. Rusty, who didn't have any body, watched them go. A while later, Mrs. Grimkin got up, turned off the light, and went out the door. Rusty, who couldn't head anywhere, just stayed on his desk. Could be worse, he thought. That's when his nose started to itch. All right, thank you for joining me for head of the class. Let me know if you have any questions over the assignments this week. Make sure you take a moment to answer that foreshadowing question. And have a wonderful week.